Yeah, I started listening to your talk with Jockin and forgive Econ.
Yeah, he's
Econ?
great. He's great.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Definitely looking forward to that conversation. I just finished up um, Mikey Downs and Nance talk about time with Nick Land,
Hmm.
and it made me think of some things that I wanted to share because I don't think they're Heideggerian enough. Um, and what that means to me is basically the position of the beautiful. So um I think a takeaway I had was a couple. So first is typically we think of being with a capital B as univocal and beings as plurivocal. That's typically how we use it. Under the beautiful position, I think it would be inverted, where being is actually the univocal. So, and being is the plurivocal. What I mean by that is, and I'm on the treadmill at the gym, so forgive me if I'm out of breath a little bit, but
I'd love to be
each
there as you're talking. The person next to you on the treadmill is like, okay, okay, I can keep pace with this. This is one way to keep pace.
you know what?
Fantastic. Oh gosh,
This could
there
go
he
like
is.
this.
Oh, this is inspiring. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's go. I'm gonna walk. All right, go. Tell me about it.
So,
Tell me. Tell me.
so each particular being, aka the domain of beings, is that particular being. Like the beautiful position would say that the one, so to speak, would be that particularity. Like not being, which would be in all particularities. Like that's how it's a multiplicity. Being is in all particularities, and therefore is a multiplicity. And beings is always constituted by a very unique particular being. And therefore, that's actually the univocal variable in the relationship. And basically, I think I've talked about the term ambivocal before. If you see how the beautiful is ambivocal, aka both uni and plurivocal at the same time, the natural logical conclusion will be the inverse of the traditional understanding of being versus beings. That you'll treat being the particular being as the quote unquote one. So when you're investigating that particularity, you're not seeing how it relates to a one because it is the one. And that flips the entire inquiry. Like that to me, then is like how the ethics there is how is that particularities unfolding relate to ethics as such? Because that particularity is unfolding is the one. And whenever you talk about ethics as such, it will always be in relation to the one. So I think that's like a totally different approach to philosophy as a whole. I don't even know if you would call that philosophy anymore because that's when you start talking about particular unfoldings. Like that's when you're really talking about like the story, the what is the what is the story essentially of that particularity. Like that's just a totally different domain. Now I could be wrong about how it's a totally different domain. Um, so that's one takeaway that I had from that talk. The second takeaway is that the relationship between time and theme. Um, Again, if you take the format that I presented in my earlier point, the the time will always have a themicization. Like there's a different. They point out a difference between time and temporality. Like Heidegger will talk about temporality a lot, but the way they talk about is temporality is already has the subject's desire in it, and that's why it's in temporality and not time itself. Um, so basically, the way I see it is that temporality is always thematized, and for it to be thematized means that that particular being, time itself for that particular being is unique to time to that particular being. Like that the time itself is always in accordance to whatever particular theme is at play. And that's it. There's no time outside of theme, because I would say outside of theme is instantaneousness. Things just instantaneously appearing. And this is where you get to Wolfgang Smith's Aventernal Realm, where outside of the intermediary realm, which is where time is, that it's just instantaneousness. It is eternity in that sense. So like, I just think thinking about like Nick Land will be like, where's the demarcation point? Like, I question if it's the human being. There's no real good reason that it's a human being. And I would say the demarcation point is any particular being. And that demarcation point rests in that particular being. There is no like universal demarcation point, because like universal in the sense of the human being will always be the demarcation point. And like, I think Nick Land is right to be a little suspicious of that. But I think him saying it's just like these lofty powers, essentially, that's where I think it's a little lazy. And that's where I think he's not really thinking about the ambivocal nature of reality. And by the ambivocal nature of reality, you get the inverse positions of being and beings. And you get a totally different orientation of life, I think, at that point. But I have more to say, but I've been talking for like 5 minutes, so I'm going to pass.
No, that's all extremely interesting. And Sam, wonderful to see you. And you know, there's a number of things that come up with that. First, I haven't seen the video. I'll have to watch it. I know Nance and Mikey have been doing some great talks over there. And you know, what comes to mind as you were speaking is the conversation I had with Jockin on partial objects, but also that very famous mystery at the end of the Paradiso, on, you know, when Dante's looking at God and the circle within a circle, and in the center is the human effigy, and there's this idea of how the human can be in the whole. Right? There is a suggestion right there that there is somehow a possibility of particularity actually being through what the universal is realized. And most of philosophy has been stuck basically in treating particularity, you know, I'll use various language, particularity and universality as opposites. Like the more particular something gets, that the more you lose the universal. But there's been this long-standing suggestion in various theology traditions and you know, some forms of philosophy that have suggested that actually no, the more you make something particular, the more it actually becomes universal. And there's a certain mystery there that has constantly sort of been orbited. And Daniel, wonderful to have you. There is a certain, and it also makes me think, so, you know, obviously the first thing is that Dante, and that I would say, is that, you know, there's a movement where thought naturally treats, you know, I'll just say to just kind of overlay with Beatrix, women as a general category and abstraction. And that becomes a quote unquote universal, you know, or something more abstract in general and so on. And then you work it down to a woman and you go, oh, well, now we're particular, right? Because we have a particular, we've moved from some sort of vast thing to a being. No. Then there's Michelle. There's women, a woman, and Michelle. And Michelle is one of one. And what's very interesting is I can know what a woman is and have a full, complete definition, but I cannot know fully what Michelle is, except without a perpetual relationship, which is very odd, because it suggests that actually as you move to particularity, your ability to fully know lessens, and yet you're glad of it. You're glad, actually, to have less of a complete understanding, because that becomes a certain invitation of participation. And what's also very interesting is as you move from women to a woman to Michelle, and this logic applies to anything basically, and that's also the suggestion, is that this possible movement, which of course is a movement of desire, and basically there is a suggestion that much of philosophy has gotten in trouble because it has lacked eros at its center. It's lacked libidinal, it's lacked desire at its center, and it's tried to actually think independent of desire. Now, I'm not, the problem is that became a certain subjectivism that then said you couldn't get at any truth in some forms. That's not what we're talking about. That's certainly not the theological tradition. The idea is that everything is actually full with an erotic potential, which is the potential of moving from woman to Michelle. That's the erotic. And the idea also is that as you move to Michelle, that you desire to know them and to be in a perpetual state of knowing. And the suggestion is that everything in the universe actually has the potential of that kind of relation, ergo beauty, which then actually gives rise to this great mystery of becoming the one, right? So in that unique plurality of particularities, and Mr. Nelson, good to see you, sir. So in that unique particularity, everything has the potential of becoming the one. And as it becomes the one, as a partial object, it actually invites you into a certain being that all things are participating in, but only to the degree that you can move things from women to a woman to Michelle. And of course, because you're finite, you can only do that for probably, well, one person would be the ultimate kind of argument of some degree. Or you start with one and you can't ever generalize. You have to start from the particular. Well, that puts us in the realm of theme then. That puts us in the realm of story then, right? And the question then, of course, and actually it just makes me think because I've been having a number of conversations this week with people who are concerned about philosophy, that philosophy replaces community, replaces relationship. And Michelle and I talk about this all the time, and there's a fine balance here. There's a suggestion that the only way to actually not fall into the trap of treating Michelle as a woman or women, worse yet, that you actually need philosophy to move from a woman to Michelle. But then the question is, when you get to that place of, reverence, or as Econ was saying, worse, and I'll throw it back to you, Mr. Luger, and then anyone who wants to speak about anything on this fine day, like the only way to actually get to that place of reverence and observing a thing for what it actually is philosophy. But at that point, are you doing philosophy, or are you doing almost something more like theology, or are you doing something in the story domain, right? Whatever it is, I would argue you can, if that's a non-philosophical space, it can only be accessed, though, through the disciplines of philosophy. Because you have to think about that, because you're assuming your frenemy brain doesn't actually like encountering Michelle. It likes encountering a woman or women. Dostoevsky would say that's the case because the more you encounter a particular person, the more Lacanian real, you have to face yourself, deal with all of that. So if your frenemy brain is actually trying to avoid partial objects, particular beings that can only be known in relation in favor of complete categories, then you need philosophy to fight your frenemy brain precisely to turn women to a woman to Michelle, a logic that applies to all phenomenon, and to keep you in that space of worship and reverence. And actually, that makes me think of what Econ was saying about how modern conservatism is now about management as opposed to reverence, which, we've talked with Russell Kirk, and I think that's true. It no longer knows what it's trying to conserve. You could, as comes up in that talk, conservatism should be trying to conserve the possibility of that intimacy. But that requires actually preserving difficulties in life necessary to create the inner space so that you can so absorb particularity, right? But you have to fight the brain to get there. I have more notes, but I'll pause and throw it back to you, Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
No, that was good. Javier said to me, I thought this was very powerful. He said, before ethics, there was story. Like before there were morals, there were just stories. Like we don't know how to educate people from the story up. We only know how to educate people from the woman and bringing it down, like the pyramid reverse. If anything, what a story does is it makes you understand an individual, and from there you postulate aspects of that individual onto other individuals. Like, it's like, I'm just being really crude here. Let's say I'm telling a story about Samantha, not saying you, Sam, but just a girl's name that just was right there. It's like this is the story of like my first period, something like in like something like very private like that. It's like through that story, you can actually take attributes of it and you can postulate, does this person also deal with that? Does this person also have that? And it's way more of a question of the woman. Like the the what a woman is from the point of the story is very much a conversation and not a definition. And then with a story, what I find really unique is like by the end of a story, you could potentially define the individual. Like, like I think that definition is up for debate, and that's what makes any good like conversation out of a story. But it's a different kind of conversation because there's something more on the definitional side at play. Like, ironically, you get the definition from the particular, not the woman. Um, and then I would say once you're able to articulate that definition, it actually immediately becomes a mystery again. Because when you articulate that definition of a woman, just using that example, um, like you basically get rubbed, that particular gets rubbed up against the multiplicity. And because it gets rubbed up against the multiplicity, it gets thrown back into the question again. But the difference is it gets thrown back into that question with some historicity, with some actual material that actually guides you in the mystery. Like if you do it the inverse, there's nothing guiding you. Like there's nothing that we would be able to agree on in the mystery. And that's the problem. Like that really is the problem. Another thing you said was basically we when you were saying how you kind of go from the woman to Michelle, it it reminds me of basically does a human being is a human being is what makes a human being, what constitutes a human being is that they have a they have a relationship with like historification and ethics, aka that they are that they literally are particular. Because if that is the case, then I understand the Enlightenment era when they're like, what's rights? Because every particular has a right. So my question is, and this is a question 'cause I'm not sure, I'm a little out of breath right now, but like, um, when did it go from, okay, we have the particularness of a person, which calls for some kind of right, but the meshing of the two creates the individual, not the person. Like that to me, like how it misfired or got to the individual instead of the person with those two variables is a little like it's not clear to me. But like I definitely think the person, like Daniel referring to our private conversation this weekend, like the person has to do with the particularness and therefore has to do with some kind of right to person. But yet, if you go too far in that logic, you get to individual, and that's bad. So what happens? I just wanted to ask that question.
That's a big one. Okay, that's a great question, Michael. Good to see you. It's a pleasure, and I'll give it to Sam here and Christian. So a few things. Yes, in the same way that I always like to think that music comes before noise, that poetry comes before language. I think stories come before ethics. We get the order backwards. That ethics is more like transpositioning is when you hear music and you write the notes, like you write out the sheet music. Like C.S. Lewis would talk about this, how the relation between story and ethics is like sheet music to Beethoven's Ninth. If I shed to you, oh, you have the sheet music to Beethoven's Ninth, that's the same as Beethoven's Ninth. There's a weird way in which that's true, but also false. we've been making that mistake in many different areas. And yeah, it is very interesting how classically, like, the tendency to teach ethics from ethics classes versus fairy tales or stories is a kind of more modern invention. And also to gather the ethic of a people together around a storyteller is also something that we have lost, because we think stories is about entertainment and other things. But the issue you're also pointing to on the movement to rights. So as you're pointing out, and this because we're trying to deal with this problem, this is the political problem of how do you honor the particular without making them unintelligible to the other. Because right now we're caught between the tension of honoring particularity and also maintaining the possibility of global connection, global interaction. And it's simply not so simple as you say, well, let's just separate and leave everyone alone. Well, you have global supply chains. Lithium is not evenly distributed around the world. I can go on, right? So there are these tensions. So basically, you could argue that our hope is found, and Benjamin Studebaker has talked about it, and I won't say too much more and throw it to Sam here, is that there's this idea of the possibility of pluralism could be found in the deliberation about the quote-unquote good in the Platonic sense, or we could say that I would stress the beautiful, the deliberation about the beautiful, that the very debate about this apophatic phenomenon can sort of be an orbiting principle. You could argue that for most of history, one of the key ways we tried to universalize was by stressing something like freedom or justice, and rights trickled down from that. I would argue the stress on a first principle is what leads to the rights, not rights to the first principle. The problem is you end up having to articulate rights to bind the interpretation of the first principle and to bind the implications of the first principle. And then people like Isaiah Berlin are later writing about how this leads to unintended consequences, because there's freedom in, freedom to, freedom from, right? So it becomes more complicated. But you could argue is that the reason we have ultimately tried to bring people together through Rawlsian procedurism is because we gave up deliberating the good. It became too difficult. And also the good felt oppressive, because who says what is good, right? Like, who, if you even say the good, like, the argument would be that who frames the space in which the deliberation about the good even occurs? Because the frame of allowing the conversation to occur itself could keep people out, right? And you get into all of those different problems, right? It's okay if, conservatives and liberals want to deliberate about the good, quote unquote, but what about fascists and communists? Well, they're not included, so you only have two. See, you have some sort of cutting out that's occurring. The question is there a quote unquote apophatic potential in every possible particularity, if rightly observed, of which could be what people deliberate about, that is realized in their suchness, that nevertheless has something to do with an apophatic character realized in every possible particular suchness, to use the Kyoto School term, right? Because if that's the case, there may be a way to deliberate about a principle that is universal and yet nevertheless particularly situated. That is the suggestion of Dante. That is the suggestion of, I think, you could say Whitehead. I mean, there are thinkers that are going in this direction, because it does seem to be the way you begin threading this. But this assumes people are actually able to be in the cora, be in the space of observing things as such. And this is where we have people like Adam Roberts stressing attention, Simone Weil. And you could argue that if that space of attention itself is not philosophical, I would argue it requires philosophy to get there, because your frenemy brain doesn't want to go there. And your frenemy brain is abstracting and making it hard to be there. I have to say more, but let me throw it to Sam here, and then I'll go to Christian. Sam, thank you for coming today.
Hi. Yeah, I think what I want to talk about in relation to this is what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw some distinctions out there and then see how they land. I think sometimes when we talk about the other, there seems to be a big difference between the other as the social and the other as the intersubjective, I guess, is how I would sort of cut it. The public other versus the private other maybe is another way to describe that. And then another thing is like, yeah, on the sort of like degradation, like losslessness from like abstraction from the universal to the particular. I think there's like a further situatedness that I'm reminded of. Like I've been thinking a lot lately about this Alain de Botton quote that I saw just like on an Instagram reel, and it was like he was saying there are certain people who make you feel really interesting. And that's very true. Like there's some people, like there are some individuals around whom, or circles of friends, you know, whether it's like a social or intersubjective experience, where I'm like so uninterested in myself. Like it's not even just that like I'm having interesting thoughts and I'm failing to share them or I'm holding them back or something. I'm just like, you know, like I'm just like it's almost like there is some, I don't know, resonance that occurs between you and the other person where you're just not seeing the world. Like the world isn't like highlighted in the same way as with when you're with other people who make you feel more interesting. And I think Alain's point is that that is what love is, but it also does speak to this like level of particularity. Like the particular is interesting. Like I've been rereading a bit of Federico Fegin's Irreducible, and in it he was talking about I forget the mathematician, but some guy's definition of information. And I thought it was really interesting because he was saying like, okay, thumbs up, that's the universal sign that essentially means like things are good. But like when you contextualize that, you know, if you're like in a hospital waiting room, somebody gives a thumbs up and there's two guys sitting in waiting chairs. One guy just thinks, oh, the procedure went well. You know, like something good happens. That's the amount of information they receive. But then the guy next to him knows that that's the doctor who's operating on his wife and that this means his wife has lived. That's like a whole flood cascade of information. Like it means like there's more information in the same encoded symbol. And so it's like, you know, like syntax and like different, given the context, like a universal becomes more particular by way of like memory and like memory. And like he's also talking about how the definition of information apparently on a mathematical level is something like the probability that something would occur like logged, which is to say that like when something is more surprising, it contains more information. Like when it's less likely, it contains more information, which is totally true. Because when you have a really like odd metaphor or something where you're like, oh, it like surprises you, it actually like opens up so much more of a concept than like just like something cliche. Anyways, I feel like this depth of information or like maybe dimensionality of attention or something, you know, these are all just like sort of vague descriptors, but I think that something of this is occurring in the particular, like as you move from the person to the woman to the Michelle, like it's almost like maybe Michelle is only really amplified in under certain contexts. And maybe there is portions of our lives and contexts where we can situate ourselves in which we aren't that particular and we are just more human than we are ourselves. Maybe that, and I could understand ourselves as seeking that in urban context. Like a lot of people talk about how actually like feeling alone in a crowd, you know, it's not where you would want to spend your whole life situated, but it has a certain feeling of like being outside of things in a way that can be really like conducive to philosophy.
No, that's magnificent. It makes me think there's some scene in Station 11 where the character is talking about the freedom of being autonomous, like not seeing, going somewhere where nobody knows how you are. And there's an actual kind of freedom in that. But then there's a certain point where that freedom turns into a certain emptiness. Right. Yeah, because we all know, like, you know, if you go to a coffee shop to do work or to do something where there's nobody you know, that's different than going and suddenly seeing someone you know, right? That kind of changes everything, maybe for good, maybe for bad, right? And that's very interesting. I think also I'm very taken by what you were also saying about like the example of the thumbs up. Mr. Jochen, good to have you, sir, on the example of the thumbs up and the differences that brings about and how memory changes things, which makes me think if memory is spirit, that there's a certain sort of, the thumbs up when it means your wife survived the surgery has a certain, it brings with it an entire spirit of like emotion versus simply a step in a procedure, right? And it's interesting how context is present and absence at the same time, right? And how, interesting enough, the context is only present if you know it, right? If you're in relation to the person. So there's always a context after like there's always a context that is, say, potentially around the thumbs up, but to actually know it depends on the relationality. It's also very interesting too, because as you're saying like this idea of being surprised and that kind of opening up things, it makes me think of how like neologisms or poetry or different ways of saying things. Like if I say, if I make up a term like a mail camera, you may go, oh, like a camera that notices when the mail comes and tells you. Like you could start coming up with ideas. I've never heard of the phrase mail camera, but if I just kind of do this with my hand, and you don't like, it doesn't quite click, it doesn't open things. So it's interesting how surprise also has a certain level of, to not just be nonsense, a certain sense of a possible relation that can be tapped into, right? So there's some sort of sweet spot there. And then what's interesting is there's the surprise that excites you and leads to engagement. Then there's the surprise that overwhelms you, and how that starts getting into the conditioning, perhaps, that philosophy brings about so that you can handle those different kinds of surprises. Then if there's too little surprise in one's life, you get bored. If there's too much surprise, you can't make sense of anything. And there's something about the surprise of beauty that is not reducible to a preset format, and yet nevertheless feels like it kind of holds you. It doesn't feel as if you're just dropped into chaos. But again, like when you move to the definitive object, the partial object, Michelle, there's a way in which you cannot fully capture it, and yet there's also a sense of trust, or my life can find a certain order and intelligibility in relation to this thing that I never complete. And that's a kind of middle between givens and releases in the Reef sense. That's a sort of where you have sense, but not the inability to be flexible. And so then again, the question is, if that sort of way of organizing and structures one's life is theoretically available to any given person in any possible particular situation, then it is perhaps practically impossible, that's what we're discussing, but not theoretically impossible for every person to actually find a mode of orientation that would align with a universal singularity, that would deal with the problem of the many and the one. But it would be very much based on orientation and attention of those people, and then the willingness to actually, face the real of the other, and what that entails in all of its beauty, but also challenge. I will pause and throw it to Christian.
Sam's point with like information, more information equals surprise. Recently, I have like 2 films in post right now, and an observation that I've had is the relationship between feeling or emotion, whatever you want to call it, and um, sense making, or just information. Because I think basically you can have an edit where it technically hits all the information points, including quote unquote emotions, which is part of that information. And yet it just feels flat. Like you don't actually feel the surprise. So what I'm postulating is information actually comes before feelings, which is the opposite of like what like Mark Solom's and like everybody's like talking about basically. And the reason why I say that is because in a lot of edits, you have the editor's cut first, and even a rough director's cut second, that just makes sure it hits all the information points. But yet there needs a bunch of additional editing zhuzhing going on in order to actually get the feeling in there. So you have to understand the information to such a degree that you're able to creatively edit differently or accordingly to that information in order to bring out the feeling of the surprise in the film. So what's interesting is in terms of editing a film, what comes first is getting the information in there, getting an assembly cut. But then you need to actually get the feeling in there, which is different, completely different than just getting that quote unquote assembly cut. So like you could have the assembly cut and it has the same information as like the real cut, but you don't feel the surprise. Like the surprise doesn't really register because you don't feel it. You might understand and be like, okay, I get it. He killed her. That's the plot twist or whatever. You know what I mean? But like, that's it. Like, you're not going to actually like be like, that was a plot twist. That was a surprise. You're not going to actually like go off and tell someone that was a surprise. It takes like a more intimate edit to get it to that level. Let me, is intuition. Ooh, that, I mean, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Yeah, yeah. Intuition first, select relevant information, then the information, then the ordering of feelings. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That sounds right. Now I'm assuming there's a lot of ways you could talk about intuition. And I'm with that Heidegger book on Kant. There's like the Kantian way of looking at intuition, which might be a little different than how you're using it, maybe not. But like I'm assuming that, like when I read that, it made sense to me. If I think the question is, what is intuition, and how does intuition relate to feeling? But I guess we might have to define each, or just get an understanding of each before proceeding. But I'll pass it back.
No, and I'm sorry for throwing a comment at you while you were
No,
speaking.
that was a great comment. I love it. Please.
Because there is a way in which I experienced that in writing a story. There's a weird, I want to call it intuition, and I always lean Bergson on that, where you intuit, oh, these are the scenes, this is the stuff that can come together. Then it becomes information, and then there is this cutting to make the feeling explode and to kind of come forth. And there does seem to be a difference between that feeling that occurs if the information is quote unquote rightly ordered or rightly arranged, and the initial intuition that this character Eve, who's appeared in front of me, if I follow Eve, I will see scenes and I will be taken somewhere where there can be a powerful experience. There is those differences, and it's very windy here. So if at any point I freeze, do let me know. I never know with Zoom, and the wind is kind of crazy outside. But anyway, so there's this intuit, like you have this experience of Eve, you have this experience that this is relevant somehow, and then you follow Eve and you figure out what books to read, whether you gather the information. And then you're working it until bam, the ending kills you, or it strikes you in a certain way, right? And so that to me, but you see, then again, the truth is that the truth comes before the rational. Like that's kind of how, to put it in my language, right? Like you somehow are intuiting a truth that then you structure rationally in order to have a certain quote unquote effect, right? But then we better get real good at that faculty of which affords us the non-rational, the true, because if not, then whatever is structured may not even have the latent potential to have the explosive feeling, because there's also kind of that notion, like to get the feeling, then you really want to make sure that you're working from the get-go with material that can generate that feeling, right? Now you could argue I would argue that all possible material could generate that feeling if rightly ordered, because everything could be a quote unquote partial object and all of that different stuff. But not any given arrangement or orientation to particularity will so generate that feeling, right? So there's also something tied to this intuition that this has something in it that if rightly arranged will actually give way to a feeling. And perhaps falling in love is tied with that as well. Perhaps picking a career and all decisions people make is actually tied to that. And I'll throw it to Ethan and then back to you, Chris. Like perhaps every time we make a decision in just about every circumstance, we follow some sort of intuition that there's something latent here that could bring forth a depth of life, beauty, revelation, all of that. And then we choose that job, choose that career, choose that person because of that intuition. And then we go about learning about them, gathering the information to know who they are and what they are, to see what needs to be ordered, and to see if that intuitive latency might come out. And maybe that's, generally speaking, what thinking is all about. Maybe at the end of the day, that's what thinking is all about, something of that kind of process. And then, of course, the question, I would argue that if the experience, and I'll throw it to Ethan and then Michael and then Christian if you're there, but Christian, no pressure, I don't want you to lose your job or anything, is that perhaps, like, if the experience of the latency as beauty or that feeling, if that itself is not a philosophical space, but maybe some may say a theological space or an aesthetic space that is aligned with something theological or mystical, however we want to put it, love space, then that space, I do think you need philosophy to get there because of your frenemy brain, dang it. Your frenemy brain is always keeping you from that, either because you get lost in information or you're stuck in the general and the abstract and you never go to the definitive object, the part Michelle. So I'll pause. I'll throw it to Ethan to talk about anything, and then Michael. And Ethan, good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well on this fine day.
Nice to see you all. Nice to be here. Yeah, this is all really good stuff. What I wanted to touch on was a couple things being said about the particular. I think Sam said something about, just like more like relationships. How do we interact with people without putting these frames on them and misframing them essentially. And as you were speaking and everyone was speaking, maybe this is a little reductionistic, but I've been contemplating lately how much fear kind of governs how I relate with people. And if someone says something, their worldview, their way of being something, sometimes it can elicit really intense experiences. And then I want to escape from that experience. And I do that by like rationalizing and putting all these frames on them to try to get this ground under my feet to make sense of this particular that you could argue cannot be made sense of fully. And so, I guess in contemplation of, I was sitting with some of my like personal experiences in relationship this last couple of weeks. And one of the things I noticed is how speaking to kind of the true isn't the true comes before the rational. And that as soon as I had a specific way of framing this person, the rest of the relationship was my entire rationalization to try to support that one experience. And I was like going and I was like I was noticing things that I regret and trying to forgive myself. But one of the things that I regret was the fact that I couldn't see how I basically had this one sense of what the other person was, that I never broke out of that frame until the relationship fundamentally dissolved. And now I'm like in a new vantage point. And so I guess, there's just an open question. I don't have any answers whatsoever, but there's an open question in my mind of, sometimes the rational feels really alive and exciting, and there's so many cool things. But more often than not, I have this sense that I just like go down these self-deceptive rabbit holes, and I have no clue that I'm going down them until years later when I break out of that frame, and I'm like, oh, I spent the last 2 years in this one frame because the rational component was so comforting and it brought so much security to me, and it brought a ground under my feet. And so maybe the question is like, is there a way to hold rationality without like grasping for it to provide a ground, or without grasping for it to provide a sense of like certainty about how things are? But can I hold the thinking process knowing that it's never actually going to give me that ground? And then when it comes to relationships, I notice specifically, like, as soon as it feels like I have a grounding of who this person is, then they become uninteresting. And so maybe there's something around, how can I like continually renew that sense of vulnerability to the other person, that such that I like never actually know them, tell myself that I know them fully. So I'll stop there. That was something.
No, that's magnificent. So, there's one thing I want to say, philosophy. Like, philosophy is this. And what I mean, so a way to envision it is and then I'll give it to Christian, Michael, and Mr. Jockin. There's a way in which the moment I decide X is true, it's as if there's suddenly a train track. Rationality lays a train track suddenly. If I accept something is true, then it's like a train track is laid that then I follow. And in a very real sense, rationality is framed in its optionality by what you have decided is true. And in a way, even though you have choice, you don't have freedom, because you have choice within that rationality, but you're not free. You're stuck on the train track. You can go slower. You can go faster. Maybe you can disconnect a card or something. You can walk around on the train track, but you can't change the direction. Like, because rationality, the moment you decide something is true, like we'll say this is where you decide is true, then train track this way. I'll use this pen, train track this way. And you're stuck going this way. There's choices going this way, but you're going to go this way because rationality is set by the truth. Now, if you go, well, wait a minute, maybe that's not true. It's as if the train track dissolves and you go back here and then you go this way. Boom. And now that's rational. And there's a new train track that goes this way, right? And when you go this way, you're going to have to go this way. You can move around on the track. You can slow down. But now rationality is going that way. But then you say, well, wait, is that true? And you go, boom, back to the origin, if you will. And then you say, maybe actually something else true. And now the train track's going this way. So look how you're changing direction. But here's the key. Here is the key. You can only go in a different direction by first going back to the origin, by going back to the first question. You can never go from train track here to train track here that way. You have to go back and then that way. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the only way you can change the directionality of your rationality is to go back and ask what is true, okay? Like, you have to re-ask what is true. And once you re-ask what is true, then you might get a new direction of rationality. But if you don't ask the question, what is true, then you actually are stuck on a kind of train track, if you will, right? Now, train track's comforting. You have direction, you know where you're going, there's security. But if it's wrong, or going in a wrong direction, or not where you want to go, you're stuck. There's no way but to go back to the first question, like, what is true? So what does philosophy do? What is salt? What is love? Do I really know who that person is? It's constantly going back to the origin. It's constantly going back to the first principles. And by asking those questions, you now have a new train track direction. You now have a new direction. Rationality can never, this is the claim, this is a giant claim I'm making, rationality can never get you from train track here to train track there by itself. It has to go back to a question about the truth, which is not reducible to rationality. It comes from apprehension, emotional intelligence, experience, encounter, so on and so forth, right? Like, you do not rationally decide that thing on the kitchen shelf is a salt shaker. You see it and then say salt shaker. You have an experience and then you say salt shaker. It's not pure rational. It's not some disembodied experiential state of which leads you to say salt shaker. You see it, salt shaker, then you do it. So the sight is really important. So, but that is where you determine what's true. You then say, it's true that there's a salt shaker here, and now there's a train track of action that can occur relative to what you have decided is true, right? So one of the, like Michelle and I were talking, and then I'll throw it to Christian, Michael, and Mr. Jockin, is that Michelle and I were talking on philosophizing your life. This creates real freedom. Hey, like, if your relationship is stuck and doesn't feel like it's going anywhere, by definition, the only way is to go back to first questions, first principles, go back to the origin. Who do I think this person is? Am I right on what I think? Maybe I don't fully understand them. So what are you doing? Your question to return to the origin means you question your understanding. It means you question your interpretation, or you suggest, what if I'm wrong, right? That's basically to say, what if this isn't the right train track? What if there's another train track I should be on? Which is destabilizing, but also liberating, because now you can go a different direction. And if your relationship is stuck or your self-understanding is stuck, that's what you need to do. You need to go to truth questions. Basically, another way to, like, let's put it this way. All freedom must begin with a certain asking of, is that true? Like, is that true? In some sense or another. That's always what you're asking ultimately. Is that true? And if rationality is what follows from a truth you've accepted, you cannot use rationality alone to ask, is that true? It can be a tool, but you're going to have to go to experience, memory. And once you have a memory, you can then, having that memory, determine what's rational, but you have to have that memory first. You have to have that experience first, et cetera, et cetera. This opens up freedom. What I would say is the following. The claim of philosophy, or a claim of philosophy I would put forth, if it's in relation to the beautiful, quote unquote, or to Michelle, a particularity, is that though the going from the train track back to the origin is destabilizing, if you always know, and I'm just calling it the origin, I am thinking kind of Heideggerian here, like if you always know that the origin will catch you, that there is always something to go back to, then even though there's something destabilizing about asking what is true, that question comes to be something you find comfort in because you experience you find a stability in the possibility of being free from your own good ideas and your own self-deception, right? And you come to also trust yourself and the people in your relationships who you have formed, dare I say, philosophical friendship with, to believe that that process will open up vistas, not merely leave you uncertain of what to do. You come to actually, when you practice the process of asking truth questions and going back to the origin, you come to trust it. When you're not used to it, you're like, well, what if I ask what is true and never figure it out, and then I never know what's rational? I better stay on the train track. Better stay on the train track. Better not do that, right? But if you do it enough and say, no, actually, we always do find a new train track. Actually, no, with my friends, we actually do open up new possibilities. Then you don't get afraid to go back to the origin, to ask what is true, because you come to trust yourself to be able to ask that question, go into yourself, go into your memory, and memory is huge here. Memory is absolutely huge here. Like, you trust your ability to go into your memory to determine what is true, to open up a new direction. And if you do that enough times, then the feeling of falling through the air, instead of being a feeling of I'm going to die, becomes the first feeling on the way to flight. So I think that's very important. But I will pause. And why pursue rationality at all? Because autonomous rationality, it's a great question, is because autonomous non-rationality is unintelligible. I can't reason with other people. I can't share my reality with other people. And I can't also determine the directionality of what I think is true. You need rationality and truth. But the problem is, it does seem to be the case that, at least in our modern age, we are more likely to overfit rationality than non-rationality, precisely because we live in under the technological essence. Like everything is, like, we're habituated socially to think far more in terms of basically just follow the procedure than we are to ask first principles. One can imagine in another society where the sociological order was perhaps very anti-technology, then autonomous non-rationality could actually be a problem. That's absolutely could be the case, where you can't use rationality to build anything because what the truth is, say, the emotional inner state, right? And that demonizes rationality, and then you get all sorts of pathologies with that, right? So you're always in a state of discerning those things, which is very, very difficult. And yes, I agree with that, Ethan. But let me pause, throw it to Christian, Michael, and then Mr. Jockin. Christian, I hope you're doing well today, sir.
Thank you. I hope all of you are doing well as well. Well. A tongue twister occurred to me while you were speaking, Daniel. Sam sells salt shakers by the seashore. Say that 3 times fast. It looks like you're by the seashore anyway, Sam. So yeah, lots of good stuff. I kind of lost track of the things I had before I had to take my phone call. But there's so much good stuff came up with Ethan's comments and your subsequent comment, Daniel. And my internet sucks today, so it'll probably freeze at some point. Yeah, where to begin? I think one of the key words that Ethan brought up that I really liked, should I turn? No, I'll keep my video off just to help with the connection. Is this fear, and I would tie in fear with Ethan's other comment or question about like uh, how do we? I think I wrote some note down here, but I'm not sure if I'm going to say it exactly how Ethan said it. Rationality. Maybe I didn't write it down, but it was something to the effect of like, how do we be comfortable with with a certain like level of uncertainty as we explore frameworks? I think something to that effect. Um, and I think that's, if I understood it correctly, I take that point as being super, super crucial question. And I think it's like maybe the thing, or not the thing, but one of the most important things that like culture has to figure out to start solving problems. Because if you have a sense of fear of uncertainty, you can't go back to the origin and you can't explore new frameworks. So how do you develop that sense of courage, if you'd like, or fearlessness in the face of uncertainty? And this is something I've explored a lot for myself. And I've tried my best to get as comfortable as I can on that edge of uncertainty. And the thing I find that gives me a sense of grounding, and I pull up this topic all the time, but it's love. And I actually, like, if I had a name for God, it would be something to the effect of the perfect loving mystery. And I hold these like notions together with a lot of intention and after a lot of contemplation, because I think that they're essential for me anyways, is like, I guess, my personal metaphysics. But for me, mystery and love and a certain kind of perfection are all like core ingredients of reality, you might say. This acknowledgement that I will never have a framework which captures reality, even at the boundaries, of course, not in the minutia, but not even in the like, goalposts, right? There's something beyond. It's the Tao that cannot be named, etc. And this, I don't know how to argue for it because it's very much experiential, but like for me, love is obviously fundamental to reality. But I don't know, you just have to write poetry when you start trying to talk about that, I think. And maybe there's an argument, but it's probably difficult to make. But for me, at least, from that position, I as I've like kind of integrated love and mystery together, that's what gives me the ability to like always go back to the origin, always go back to intellectual humility, because there waiting for me is love, right? And part of this actually came up for me when I was doing like death contemplation meditations as like an intentional practice, and tried to imagine as best as I could, like, what would it be like to die? And it's an impossible thing, I guess, maybe, but I just tried to like methodically imagine that every aspect of my experience was like, the color black was used. I'm sure maybe it doesn't matter, but it at least everything was like trying to move into a singularity. And for me, it was just like this black field of vision. And but that included like my emotions. Anyways, what I noticed was that as I was moving into that experience of fake death, that anxiety was coming up in my body. And then I explored the anxiety, and I'm like, why am I anxious about death? Why am I anxious about the unknown? Why am I anxious about this sense that I'm going to be separate from life and the things that I love? And it's because I love them. I'm like, oh, Yeah, of course that's why. Why else would I be afraid? Because I don't my love draws me toward life, and death is taking me away from that which I love. And what that opened up for me was like the love is the one thing that's not going to go away even at the moment of death, right? As long as I'm, allowing it to kind of flow through me. So, the death might be scary, it might be heartbreaking, but there is that the reason why it's scary is because I love life, and the love is not going away, or at least I can't imagine it going away. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a long rant. I don't want to say I had a lot of notes, but I feel like I've already said a lot. Um, I'll put this one in here. The thing you said, Daniel, I don't know if I got it quite right, but something like the feeling of flight is the fuck. How did I thought I wrote it down? I think about blah, blah, blah. You said something like the feeling of flight, or no, the feeling that I'm going to die is the movement towards flight. And what that brought up for me was a quote that I've probably said before because it's one of my favorites, but a quote from a Buddhist about how the bad thing about enlightenment is that it's like jumping off a cliff, but the good thing is that there's no bottom. And so, yeah, there's that sense of, if you really dive all the way into intellectual humility, like all the way into like, I do not know, I know that I do not know. What was previously a kind of familiar intellectual grounding that gave you a sense of orientation, gives you your sense of self, your sense of continuity, all of that, poof, it's gone. The rug has been pulled. But then as long as you're not trying too hard to like desperately hang on to the cliff that you've just jumped off of, if you're not fighting against it, it doesn't take too long to realize, oh shit, there's nothing bad has happened. I'm all right. And there's no bottom. And now I'm just enjoying this kind of like, it's like a flow state kind of. But for me, like going into those states when I first was exploring them it was very disorienting and scary. But then here's the last thing I'll end with, because I just thought about it today. I was thinking about intellectual humility this morning, and I was remembering when I first encountered the whole idea of it when I was, I don't know, maybe like 19 or something, and how enlightening it was, and the deep sense of freedom it gave me to like admit to myself that I don't know. Like I was very good at seeing that other people didn't know, and then I realized, oh, I don't know either, and it was this beautiful feeling. And I hadn't really felt into it. I think because we have to spend so much of our waking hours knowing shit so that we don't die, that we don't take a lot of opportunities to like fully relax into the not knowing feeling. And I was like, fuck, let me just relax into that. And the phenomenological experience was, yes, this kind of freedom and relaxation, but also something I can kind of put words to better now than I could when I was 19, which is there's a feeling of truth, which is, irrational or something. It feels alive, and it feels like everything is like buzzing or crackling with this sense of truth that isn't pointing me in a certain direction, but is just orienting me toward the present moment. But I find that so interesting that in the absence of any kind of idea, any kind of proposition or framework, the sense of truth doesn't go away. It just kind of takes on a more transcendental form, I'd say.
No, very well said. And I laughed really hard when enlightenment jump off a cliff and there's no bottom. That's grand. A few things, and I'll give it to Michael, Mr. Jochen, and Ethan here. So, it's very interesting. When you say that, God equals perfect loving mystery, the perfect loving mystery, if I say that correctly. That's very interesting, because then if humans are the image and likeness of God, then Michelle, quote unquote, is a loving mystery. Not a perfect loving mystery, only God is a loving mystery. And is that not true? Like, that actually what ends up happening as a woman becomes Michelle, there is a loving mystery. I never fully know Michelle, but you know that they love you, and actually in that relationship, the loving of you by the mystery is precisely the condition of possibility for the unfolding of the mystery evermore. Because a mystery is not something that you cannot know, but that, as Flannery O'Connor says, that as you know, there's always more to know. And it's interesting to think that only in the context of love would you actually be, in a sense, allowed into the mystery so that it can ever unfold before you, right? Or so that you can meet the condition of fully experiencing it, and one can take that logic to all things. I'm also interested, like, it's very interesting too, what you're saying about this idea, because like love is a covenant, right? And that is interesting because you have this problem of how does the no thingness not lead to chaos? Well, if there's something about the mystery having love, love has a way of ordering in grace, not in like law or duty. And Jock and I had a wonderful talk with Echomancer about that. Like love has a way of ordering without like, you know, force and power, right? So if love actually, if there's something about the origin that has qualities about it that are love, then this is something covenantal. And there is something like, because there is something when you basically say, I am always in this relationship willing to go back to the origin, to ask questions of first principles, and that's the covenant, then that actually creates structure in a way. That actually creates order, because you're always willing to go back to ask those what, why, and philosophical questions precisely. And by precisely doing that, the relationship doesn't get stuck on a train track. It doesn't get stuck in your ideas. That the covenant to go back to create the dymosism means that the order comes from the ever commitment to go back and make it alive again. Which then is how you avoid an order that leads to a train track that keeps you stuck in it loses dymosism, like, and you can't get out of it, and yet nevertheless does not lead to chaos, because every time you remember, I guess I want to say, every time you go back to the origin, a rationality will spring from it, an order will come from it, right? Like if you go to the origin, you're not going to go chaos, because every time you go there, if you're not like ignoring rationality, if you're willing to do the work of rationality, there will be a logic, an order, a direction that comes from that. And so you just have to overcome your fear of chaos and trust that that will come forth. And there's a way too, where it's almost as if what one does when you have the right relation to the mystery or love, it's like if this is the origin from which is the non-rational, the truth, from which the train track comes out of. I have an obsession with trains today, but I like the track has this kind of, you must go in this direction. Then basically, if you can stay focused on that, then there's train tracks coming out of it. There's always going to be direction, but you stay here. So there's ever creativity. There's ever creativity that's coming. And you can go that way, but then you can come back, and you can go that way, and you can come back, and you're never stuck in your ideas of things. In fact, you're able to make rationality playful. And thus the relationship becomes playful, because you can go down a train track, explore that directionality. This isn't working. Go back to the origin, go a different way, explore that. So going back to the origin, asking the philosophical questions like philosophy makes rationality playful, because it is able to go back to the origin, and it makes relationships playful. It makes conversations playful, and play has order. Play is not chaos. And then it would seem like God is playful. Loving mystery, the perfect loving mystery, the perfect play, because play has a mystery and a sort of love to it as well. You don't know how it's going to unfold. Gadamer, and he always stresses play for ontology. But by keeping that focus on the origin, then yeah, there's going to be train tracks coming out, but you're never a prisoner of those train tracks that are generated from the origin, because you're able to play. And then that means you have something solid, but you're able to hold it in the right way. So the ability to always go back, but here's also the issue. This gets into the problem of Mary. I'll throw it to Michael and Jockin. As you're going down that train track, and you have this idea of this person in the relationship or friendship or job or boss or whatever, and they won't listen to me, and you really come to feel like you know the truth. They're a jerk. Like you really come to be certain that you understand. You forget to go back to the origin. You forget to ask why questions. You forget to question yourself. This is why memory is so huge. If you can't do it, you can't we've been saying memory is spirit. If you can't remember to ask the philosophical questions to go back to the origin, you can't bring spirit back to your life. Your job will die, your marriage will die, your relationship will die. Because as you get down a trajectory of rationality, and the longer you're on that train track, the more it feels like there's no other train track. The more it feels like that's the only direction to go. The longer you follow a rational course, the harder it comes to remember to ask fundamental questions that can liberate you from that direction, like that Cleel angel of history. And so what ends up happening is people get so sure that they're right about that person. That person is stubborn. That person won't listen. That person is an a-hole. This will never work. Or maybe this will work and this person is wonderful when actually it's toxic and it's bad, right? They become so sure of that it removes from them the memory that they need to always be checking and balancing themselves with origin questions, with those questions. And so you have to have memory. But if you forget, you also forget you forget. So you don't know that you're not remembering to do that. And we are all, and the human condition is to always be in the middle of this problem. Hence, you need communities to remind you. Hence, you need people in relationships to help you remember what you forgot. And therefore, I'm glad we all get together on Thursday. But let me throw it to Michael and then Mr. Jochen. Michael.
Good to be here. Yeah, there's so many things. I got a full Post-it worth of things that I hopefully will be able to get through. But yeah, I wanted to start by just kind of, I guess, scaffolding what I want to say in a personal anecdote from this morning. I was in Jacob Kashir's Resident men's group today, and a new thing he's doing this year with the group is something called the Crucible, which is basically any man is able to step in and take a dilemma that they're working through in their life, something they're wrestling with, and have time to share it, and then have time for the other men to share their reflections, their insights, proposed solutions. Yeah, it's really just a beautiful thing. And so last week the two other men in the circle had a chance, so it was my turn to step into the ring today, and I brought something that like I really didn't want to bring, but it was like one of those things that it felt like what needed to be brought. And what I realized through the process of explicating and hearing back was, because someone at some point was like, oh, I can really tell the kind of frustration and like pain that you're experiencing, kind of like working through this. And I just had like the question, I was like, is that actually mine, or is that some societal script that I'm like kind of superimposing onto my life, assuming that this is the way to do this, or this is like the outlook to have, and that's causing me all this strife because I can't get just like the experience of the relationship. And I was like, oh, like that's actually like really great, and like everything with that is like really beautiful, and like that's the heuristic that I should be having, as opposed to this kind of like end that I'm associating. And I think that was like a really kind of philosophical moment of like stepping back and asking those like fundamental first principles questions of like what is truth, like what is my like qualitative metric, for to use a really kind of scientific way of looking at it, but like what's my like metric for success in this relationship? Is it the kind of qualitative like experience of this person, how much joy and beauty and vitality and depth, or is it, like what it should look like or whatever? And I realize I'm being vague. I just, kind of want to have some degree of anonymity over it. But so that was something that I wanted to bring in, is like asking that question, like, because Christian was talking about kind of overcoming the fear and anxiety and kind of having that courage to step into that epistemic humility. And I think certainly asking the question, even before, like, I think there's a first principles question even before you kind of decide if you have fear or anxiety. Is this mine? Like, is this coming from genuinely from me, or is this something that I feel like I have to please someone, or like adhere to someone else's standard, or yada yada. And that always gets kind of complicated and muddied once you're in community, because to be in community means that there are certain communal norms that you have to adhere to have a certain degree of structure and kind of integrity. But kind of even before you say, okay, I have fear, anxiety, whatever, and I kind of want to sit with that and work with it, like even just asking the question, like, where is this originating from? The other thing that I wanted to talk about before I pass it back is this idea of memory, and kind of memory being an instrument for beauty. I know Jockin talks about that, and kind of memory leading to kind of this opening in a relationship where you kind of break from the certainty. It almost seems like when you are locked into a very defined sense of who someone is, you're actually kind of corrupted by memory, because all you can think about is all the times that they were an a-hole to you. All you have your kind of like arsenal of grievances, and they're so they're so vivid in your mind. And I'd be curious to hear anyone's thoughts on it, but it almost seems like, to access the memory that you're talking about, Daniel, it's almost like you have to question memory, and kind of like flip memory on its head, so to speak, which can lead to an opening where either you access like historical memories of that person that kind of contradict what you were had held in your mind, um or maybe you access this more kind of fundamental love, or you know desire for love, that allows you to bring that energy into the relationship, and from that loving place, as opposed to a kind of calcified judgment. You kind of like reveal the moreness of the person through that. Like, maybe you actually don't, maybe you actually can't access a historical memory of them being anything other than you know horrible, whatever. But your kind of ontological stance has been shifted from one of judgment, rigidity, certainty. It seems like certainty is kind of the root cause of nihilism, and that play that starts to happen. So yeah, just before I pass it back, I was just thinking of the history is doomed to repeat itself. I think everything, every kind of societal message starts at an individual level, and I think individuals believe that about themselves and other people. If I what do they say, like, if something happens three times, it's a pattern. Like, if you see someone or yourself doing something repeatedly, you think that it's just doomed to repeat itself, and then you kind of get caught in this like parasitic feedback loop, and like act like that surprise, right, that Luber was talking about earlier, that ability to be open to surprise yourself or be surprised by someone else, to act, to go, someone who's going A, B, C, D, and then they do Z out of nowhere, and like actually recognizing that and being open to that, being open to change, being changed in that kind of humble stance. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, fantastic. You've got me thinking. So there's a way where to go into memory is almost kind of, I'm going to say, like going into a mythological realm, because you have sort of the enemy of recollection that are your bad enemies that you kind of have to fight and to overcome. And so there is something about when you go into memory, it's almost in a sense entering a quote unquote spiritual realm. And some of the things that you actually have to say fight are actually just your quote unquote recollections of people that actually make you right. And there is a sense here which is very interesting. So there's a few things. You use the word originated. So basically what I am suggesting is that rationality is always quote unquote originated. It is always originated out of an origin. It is always projected. It is always from an origin, right? It comes out of something. Rationality is never an origin. That is my claim. It is never an origin. It is what follows from a quote unquote origin. Therefore, rationality is always original. It's also always kind of created. It's a kind of original, and it carries with it the origin of itself, right? And so in a sense, you never escape an origin from within a rationality, right? It is set by the origin, right? And if your problem is the origin, your take on it, like your understanding, then you need to return to the origin to change it so that you have a different originality. And in this sense, rationality is always originality. I'm doing word plays here. So rationality is always a kind of originality. Well, how else do you get to the origin but memory? Because origin has always already happened. So like origin and memory, like the only way to the origin is memory. So therefore, the only way to liberate yourself from a train track of rationality is going to entail some sort of return to the origin. And seemingly memory is the return to the origin. Memory is the road to the origin. Memory is the spiritual trek to the origin. And so like in this way, because like if you have an origin, that means it's already past. Like if it's an origin, it's already occurred, right? So it's not present anymore. You have to remember it. And yet, if in another way, the origin is also always present in what is. So you have to go into memory to see how origin came to manifest as it currently is, because that's not necessarily going to be given unless you ask how questions, because your rationality is like, well, because it was rational, that's why. There's no questions to be asked. You have to ask how questions to actually destabilize how your life has come to be, to realize it could be something different. And that always means you're kind of returning to the origin, like returning to how you came to understand this person so that you can open up a new possibility, right? Like, because I guess to make that more concrete is if I decide, Jim here is a dick, like Jim is a bad person, and I start going, Jim isn't a bad person, then I have to, in some sense, go back to how I originally thought about them, go back to the things that made me conclude he was a dick, and either A, give them less authority, choose to not let them have a hold. I have to change my relationship to the things that originally led me to the conclusion that Jim was a dick, right? And that may require, and that's going to require some level of going into myself, because a lot of times, we think Jim is a dick because of stuff that happened in our childhood that we don't remember, or how that person reminds us of our uncle or something. And we have to detach all of those things, which has a kind of spiritual work to it, or else we are not able to actually treat Jim rationally in a different way because we believe he's a dick. And if we believe he's a dick, what becomes rational to do? relative to Jim is different than if we believe Jim isn't a dick. But that requires doing work. And yeah, no, I think you have to access the particulars there, Ethan. And the problem is the brain doesn't like particularity because it takes work and it tends to go to generality. Ergo, you need philosophy. So you need philosophy to, in this sense, go on the journey of memory, to go to the origin, to actually open up a new possibility. And if you don't do that, you're going to be stuck on some train track of rationality and you won't be able to get off of it, right? And I also would just add too, as we're speaking, and more can be said, and I am doing some perhaps confusing word plays on the word original and or originate and different things like that, to just simply to suggest that rationality is always original. It always carries with it an origin, and I'm doing a word play there to suggest it's also creative, which means it doesn't have final authority, and yet nevertheless it creates structure as well. But it just also to kind of draw in the point of how philosophy has this kind of return to the origin to open a different directionality of rationality. There is a weird way in which like philosophy questions are not rational. Like if I ask, just from the talk Michelle and I did, what is a salt shaker? Is that a rational question? Why are you asking what is a salt shaker? We all know what a salt shaker is, dang it. And we have a definition of a salt shaker. Like we know what a salt shaker is. For you to ask what is a salt shaker means you're saying the common knowledge maybe needs to be questioned, that this thing that we've been able to use every day needs to be reconsidered. If we ask what is love, we're suggesting that what the society has settled upon is perhaps inadequate. We're suggesting that the definition is not there. Like asking philosophical questions seem rational because the moment we ask the question, we begin using rationality to think about the question, but the question itself is non-rational. It's weird. Like philosophical questions are weird. That's why people don't do philosophy, because they're weird questions. But it's precisely because they're weird that they can get you off a train track of rationality onto a different train track of rationality. It's precisely because they're weird that they can take you back to the origin, of which can then open a new directionality that then create freedom. If you don't ask weird questions, then you're not going to be able to have freedom. You'll be able to have choice moving around on that train, but you're not going to be able to get on a different train track. And so weird questions are important. So I'm glad we can ask weird questions. I'll give it to Jock and Ethan, Christian and Daniel. And if anyone has anything else, let me throw it to Mr. Jock. And Mr. Jock and I enjoyed speaking the other night, sir.
Yes, it was a pleasure. And I just realized I was unmuted this whole time.
No,
I
no.
apologize.
No issue.
I didn't make any noise. I think the first part with kind of I jumped in when Luber was talking. Is Luber still here? I don't think Luber's here. No, he don't. All
He's
right,
here in spirit, in memory. He's here in memory.
Well, I think the big point about information and surprise is the problem of you can have general information, but that's not where surprise is. Surprise is in the particular. And it's actually the mismatch between generalizations or general premises or points with the particularity. That's where surprise shows up. So and this is actually true in the arts in the sense of if there's no tension in the work, like a lot of the work in the arts is tension. What's tension? Tension is another word for lack, for friction, for basically the kind of energized present absence at the same time of the work, usually of some kind of response to constraints. Particularity is response to constraints. And that's typically what makes it not particular, is when there's no constraining presentation in front of you. So I think just that's the first note I reminded of that. That's why you can have a perfectly coherent sentence with that doesn't have surprise. Like information it's things presented to you. It's not surprising. I think that's important aspect to think about this. And I think the origin with originated, I wrote about this a couple weeks ago about proportion identity, but with specifically what's called rootedness, the root, radix from Aquinas. It's the idea of the summary note is how can something be said of many, yet of one that is none of any of the qualifications of genera, species, difference, like Katajan goes through this whole line. All the metaphysical categories say, yet this thing called proportion identity is present, yet is none of these other categories. So what's going on here? And I did some secondary research on it, and probably the best answer is this concept called root. So it's actually Aquinas says some things are present by principle, right? But also by roots. And root is very much something meaning something that is what you're reading by memory. It is an origin in which many. I'll give you an example to kind of maybe paint this picture a little clearer. The very fact that my study in philosophy is like Aristotle, Plato, right? Yet I can communicate intelligibly to other people who understand Hegel. Now, I want to make an argument that's because of a historical accidental fact of this tradition, right? But that's that's one way to talk about it. Another way to talk about it is there's a root that allows for intelligibility even with difference, just to kind of part that through. And even when there's disagreement, by the way, like basically the account may be different of Hegel versus Aristotle, but there's a intelligibility from that. So I think that's and in terms of talk about what we mean by this, and I think also it's actually related to honesty too. You know, because I think this idea of like another mode of talking about truth that I think the arts get really interested in is about what's honestinium. You know, what is the kind of honesty of the account or the presentation? Is this not honest? When we may not say a true account, it's just an honest account. And I think a big part of that, and I think Michael brought it up, and I think it's very fair. And I'll tell you something. You know, again, I'm just the amount you always choose to disclose about when you're in a direct event of mourning is very important. I think the big thing like people don't remember because of how painful the memories are. No, because that's the thing. Because like, listen, my father passed away. I saw his body, and I can sit here and that's the thing. Like the actual terror of horror, talking about the decaying body, the coldness of the flesh, the particularities of that body with the soul gone from it. It wounds me to even talk about it. Trust me. Why do you want to remember that? It's easy to forget that. And by the way, but yeah, I point this out. I'll see something very important. And again, I think it's a little autobiographical, but I think it's important. So when my father had his stroke when I was 13, that was a great calamity of the highest order. He's paralyzed on the right side. It completely it ruptured the whole household. Everything got reverted. Radical parentification, understandably so. You know, we lost our father figure, and he was paralyzed on the right side, severely mentally developed harm from that. And my response, there's much of my memories gone. I didn't want to remember. I wanted to forget. But now at the end of the life, especially under the life of caretaking for that man, for my father, who I love very much, and death really reveals to you what you actually are beyond the accounts. You can have your image of yourself, what you think you are, and then death reveals to you what this relationship actually meant to you. And you know what I really find interesting? I am even all the time past before the death, I wanted to forget, especially as a child. I wanted to forget all those memories. But now that he's gone, the death has occurred. I want all those memories. I want it back. I think that's like, I don't know what that is. I couldn't even articulate what that's about, but I want to point out that double move of, I think, our relationship to memory. Most of us, by their trauma and the harm of it, want to forget. We want to forget it. We don't want to address it. But yet there's real, and you have the freedom and choice to do that, by the way. But it's actually through that memory and that relationship to memory, you can go the other side. There is a possibility. I think that's kind of the point. I think the big question on relationships is the idea of that the account is definitive and there's no way to reinterpret it. But isn't it interesting in death? In that one moment, it's both conclusive in this world. This person's gone, right? But yet that relationship with that person and the relationship that person was around can retroactively be completely transformed. And in multiple times it happened. For example, there are family members that were estranged for 15, 20 years. They reunited over the body of my father. They reconciled. And actually, the most devastating part was, Daniel, and I talked to you privately about this. It was weak speech. There was a misunderstanding that was misinterpreted, and it cost 15 years of relationship. It was very interesting, just that aspect. And personally, for me too, I had an estranged best friend that I grew up with. I knew him for 25 years. We were estranged for 5 years. But when he got news of the death, he called my father. He called me immediately, and it was like all that issue was removed, instantly vaporized. All strife, all contention, love poured through, and unified in a way that I don't think anything else would have done it, to be honest. So it creates a very interesting dynamic now, doesn't it? I could just say again, and this is my own personal experience of death. Everyone is different about it. And I only, it's always a balancing act. So you want to sharing these points. It's like you want to add a contribution to a conversation. But you get in a very mixed state of like, when we talk about why the human must die, I think this is one of those points. If we enter a space where death is considered a disease to be optimized away, that's you're cutting off what this aspect of reality is about. And it is the most painful part. Listen, I say all this. If someone told me, hey, guess what? You can have your dad back. You can have all these experiences, get your dad back. Oh, come on. I'm not going to sit here and say, no, dog. I don't want that. And I'm a religious person. It's not even with the nod of the theological reality of what's in play here. You know what? My love, my father is still like it's still there. And by the way, trust me, that's a big test in your religious orientation. By the way, you know, because really we should love God first, and that we should know rationally. Like again, on this theological account, we know He's in a better place. But yet, this my love for Him and this body of mine screaming, "I want my dad back." Right, is what it is. But yet, even with those acknowledgments, I can also see what the real reality of life really requires, that limit of death. When Heidegger talks about this, you only understand being by the encounter of death. This is what I really believe is what he means by this. You don't have a leverage, you don't have a reference point to understand the right orientation of our relationships. Just from the very fact of something needs to be quite bluntly, isn't it? It's kind of interesting when we talk about it. Is that the nudge? I don't know if it's a nudge. It's certainly a reckoning. I don't know if there's a difference of, if that means a difference of language. I only say this because probably the difference is, just from the econ and Daniel talk I had with them, nudges are a kind of passive imposition onto subjectivity to make you make decisions, to make you go to certain protocols without explicitly making you decide. So it removes judgment. And actually, that's how I know it's different, because it removes judgment. It basically tries to remove judgment and move from apprehension to action with a frictionless movement to a certain optimized outcome decided by Magentero class. But death seems to be the opposite, because it is actually a moment of reckoning in which you must decide the relationship. You must decide, what does this relationship mean, and you must decide what are the terms and parameters of your life. Because I definitely feel that way. I mean, part of this is also the absolute. I mean, that's why I didn't want to talk about this very clearly or very much, because talking about death absolutely obliterates the symbolic order and annihilates it. Because it makes all other talk seem ridiculous and of the smallest magnitude. I feel bad. It kind of like, and it happened last time I talked to the net. I waited to the end to even bring it up, because I knew when I said it, it was going to cause this like kind of dumb it's almost like, how do you respond to it? It's actually very similar to a lot of people who complete their projects, like Aquinas. He does all this work with a theologian and concludes it's all straw, right? Like, another thinker saw that. A lot of thinkers who've gone through the really hard work of symbolic thought and process and made a perfect system, or tried to, then come to the end of it as a kind of death and go, oh, it was actually it's nothing. It's dust. I think of it that way. So, but yet nevertheless, you need this limit. You must have this limit. This limit must exist, because it's the only way to have the reckoning of what actually matters in our lives. And I think about that a lot, because I think it's very part of the maturing process of what it means to be alive. Is to have this real, and it's a thing, it's like, it's not an intellectual thing, it's a particularity of this body, of this person, of this relationship. It cannot be this like abstractional imagination, because that's the thing, because I knew, but my father was sick for almost 30 years. And he really, I mean, the doctors, he was a living time bomb. It was a miracle he lived as long as he did. So I had many intellectual, imaginary projections of what death would be. What would that be like? We had the anxiety of that. Oh no, none of that worked out. None of it actually played out the way the imagination of mine thought it did. It got revealed to me. Truly, it got revealed to me who I actually am in those moments. Very grateful about it. Very, very blessed that my life became the way it is. Mostly because I didn't have the horrible taint of regret. Because there were some people in the family that did have regret, and you can see very clearly. And now they have that. And the rest of their lives, they have to address that now from this point going forward. So I think I kind of spiraled out a little bit in a second, but the main note is the idea of information and surprise, and the rootedness, and what is the roots and the honesty of the experience. I think the big note is that relationship of specificity and the limit encounter of death, or kind of the limit to understand, to return to the origin, and kind of here. That's my point. So the reality, the honesty of what it is not even live a good life. What is a true life? What is an honest life? We have to return to the origin. And the origin is to find out where all these accounts and all these presentations and understandings about it, were they rightly ordered or not. You're only going to find out in the death encounter. But I will comment that certain preparation in philosophy does prepare you for it. Because at least it's, trust me, the waves of the emotions will come for you and they take you away. But with cultivation in time, those waves calm down and you can think more on it. And you find out you surprise yourself even what you are. And that's part of the philosophical project, I feel like. I'll stop there.
No, very well said, and thank you for sharing that, Mr. Jock. And I'll give it to Ethan here, Christian, Daniel, if you still want to speak, and then Michael. It's very interesting because there is something about death that has this take you back to the origin. And as you said, there's something where death can fix friendships, fix relationships, make you overcome disagreements, because it gets you off the train track. And perhaps from a theological account, perhaps there are some train tracks that if there was no death, we would never get off of. That perhaps death has a very important function, because there are train tracks that only death can get you off of, back to the origin, and head you in a new direction. And if that is the case, and perhaps that could be the case in many different ways, not just the experience of death, but just the notion that death exists, may actually get you off tracks of rationality that otherwise you'd never be free from, then perhaps all efforts to remove death, whether it be technology or whatever, could perhaps unintentionally get us stuck on a train track then we could never get off of. A world where nobody died might be a world where those people that came back together over the death never did. Those misunderstandings of speech were never resolved. One could, if there are certain resolutions in life that are afforded because of death, then a world without death would be a world where those relationships are not mended. And so that may be that is a very high cost. It is very interesting. Also, I would argue that nudges don't take you back to the origin. Nudges are about keeping the train moving. Like nudges are on a train track and they want you to keep moving. They don't want to, they're about keeping you from going back to the origin and changing direction. Whereas what we're talking about is returning to the origin. Also too, I think, the social order wants to get rid of death because, like you said, death destroys the symbolic order. People in power want the train to keep going, and death actually makes you ask philosophical questions, dang it. It makes you ask questions that get you to first things that could make you deconstruct the social order, and the people in power do not want that. But then, of course, as Hume warns, if you have bad philosophy, you could say that bad philosophy uses deconstruction not to get back to the origin, but to stay on a train track. Like, there's something about bad philosophy that doesn't get back to the origin. It actually says all train tracks are wrong or something, or that it is all arbitrary. Whereas the right use of philosophy is actually not to deconstruct rationality, but to keep it mobile, to keep it flexible, to keep it not in its own prison. But the symbolic would like to keep you, the people in power would like to keep you on whatever train track you are that they run. I'm also now thinking about, and then I'll throw it to Mr. Nelson here, on this idea of the root. Basically, what we are suggesting is, if it is the case that all things, when definitive, as we move from, I'll just say it this way, general, women, to particular, a woman, to definitive, Michelle, cats, a cat, fluffles, trains, a train, the GOAT line, or whatever it was in that book, because I know Nelson was reading Atlas, from like, as you move to the definitive, then the suggestion is that if everything in their definitiveness entails a root, like the root is found in the definitive, then the possibility of universality and singularity opens up, which is basically the holy grail of the possibility of our current political moment of global pluralism, to not either fall too far on the side of a tribalism where we all end up in World War III, or a global unity that replaces us all with some giant AI singularity or monoculture that kills individuation. So if we don't want either of those, we need the root that you are describing. Seems very important. And if it is located in definitiveness, which I think it is, then the root that makes possible the universal doesn't sacrifice particular difference, but actually glory. It's to their glory, actually, because it's only found in it. And I think love, well, I think you only get to the place where a particularity becomes definitive, where a woman becomes Michelle, where a cat becomes Mr. Fluffles, if you have a certain attention and love, right? And a commitment, a covenant. Like that commitment then creates order. And so we avoid the problem of flying off into chaos, right? And so your confidence comes not so much from an abstract worldview, but from a concrete relation that you are working to make a space where a woman stays as Michelle, which is a loving mystery that always unfolds. And in that condition, a root is encountered that actually all things in their definitiveness entails, if so realized. And so in that space, we start seeing the possibility of universal singularity. But I have more notes, but I'll pause and I'll throw it to Ethan, Christian, Daniel, and then Michael. Ethan, please.
My head is spinning. My head is spinning. This is all great. Yeah, I don't actually have any particular things. I've been bouncing around a bunch of different stuff, but I'll just kind of flow, be spontaneous here. Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is this concept of origin point. I feel like I'm grasping it, and then it feels like I'm completely grasping it wrong, or I have a different grasp of it. Originally, kind of going to what Christian was saying, like this perfect loving mystery, or you go back to this not knowing, or this like this deep like what is actually true. But what I was sitting with as you all were speaking, we brought in memory, right? We brought in memory, going back to the origin of when I first met this person, my conception of them was this, and then this happened, and I solidified into this perception of them. Now I have to go back to when did I originally solidify this way of understanding this person, and how do I like, see the emptiness of that or something. And so what I'm struggling with is how do I frame it? If the origin point is like this, like not knowing, wouldn't memory be a form of knowing? Like, isn't memory a form of like us, like me trying to like remember or know the original conception? And wouldn't that not fully bring me back to the origin point? Or maybe just a riff here is like through the use of that memory is the memory like a tool to arrive at that not knowing? And when you spoke, Daniel, about what was it? Let me go back to my comment. About can you detach without accessing the particulars? And your response was no, the particulars are how you detach. Some part of me, and maybe it's like part of my being heavily influenced kind of like by like Buddhist philosophy, Eastern traditions, which seem to tell me that, or which my conception as I dive into them is that through like seeing into the emptiness of things, it's like do I really need to see into the particulars of every single thing in order to see that the root is like just deep not knowing, and then to like notice the attachments without knowing maybe exactly what the thing is that I'm attached to. So that's something that I was sitting with. And yeah, I guess speaking to Thomas's points of death being like this ultimate, death being this catalyst for coming back to the origin point, are there always going to be these train tracks that we're on that we just have no way of knowing that we're on until something cataclysmic happens in our life? That's a really interesting thought. Because part of how I relate to that is, okay, like with like romantic relationship, one of the points was I was viewing this person in a very particular way, and after the relationship has ended, it has me asking, like, is it only in the ending of the relationship that I now have the possibility to go back to the origin, or like, why was it so damn hard to get back to that origin point and to reconfigure that relationship while I was participating in it and deeply within it, as opposed to completely separated out of it. And yeah, it's like when I contemplate it, there's this deep freedom that I feel in like reconfiguring it and noticing all these different potential complexities that I didn't see before without trying to grasp onto any one. And I just ask, like, why? Like, this goes back to the fear. Is it like I was just too afraid to deconstruct it while I was within it? Now that I'm not within it, it's easier to deconstruct it because by definition it's already collapsed, so I'm not afraid of it collapsing anymore or something. So I'll stop there. That's kind of like what was going on as I was listening to all of you guys speak.
Those are all excellent points. And yes, the language of origin that is coming up in this conversation can indeed be confusing. I do have a Heideggerian kind of sense of it in mind. And it's an excellent question on, isn't there something about memory and going to the origin that has a kind of knowing, and isn't that kind of antithetical to the no-thingness that we are suggesting? For me, part of the work of memory is actually precisely that it is full of certainty, and that what you're kind of doing is adding no-thingness to it, that you're going through and saying, like, actually, I think I know who this person is, and you're going into your memory and deconstructing that. You're going into that, and I have a Bergsonian sense as well, that actually memory is rightly creative. It opens up, where you go into it to add no thingness to it, that then opens it up. Whereas, and we've sometimes made distinctions between memory and recollect, whereas with recollection, you're just using the past then in service of your interpretation you have. So you're using it in service of your rationality. And actually, a lot of the work of memory is, at least for me, and it makes me think of, Augustine books, I think book 11 or 10 or whatever, on this idea that you find God in memory, which is odd, but he also is suggesting that memory and imagination are, once we try to make these distinctions, they're ultimately are all arbitrary, that there's this kind of inner life that is a mixture of images of the past, things that could be the future, things were created, and it all is just kind of is folding and occurring and unfolding and occurring, and that there's a kind of work we need to do in that space of ourselves precisely to actually, not end up on a train track where we don't want to go, actually, to not end up pulled along by that Cleel angel of history. So there's a way in which going to the origin, like the origin is rightly a no-thingness. Like it is, but I want to say it's an apophatic no-thingness, which means it always is birthing, it's creating. Like there's like the apophatic is this overwhelm of possibility, right? So so for example, like if I think of Michelle that I've been using as an example today, thank you, honey. When you first fall in love and a woman becomes Michelle, you experience them as this excess, this creative overflow, like all of these possibilities that have this sort of beauty that's coming out. And then what ends up happening, or can happen, is as you get bills and you go along, you forget that access, you forget that, and you have a single understanding of who they are. Like a single, like train track of it, right? And what you actually need to do is go back into memory, deconstruct that train track to get back to the excess, the definitiveness that had all of this coming forthness. Because when you first fall in love with someone, especially once it enters into covenant, there's this real feeling of creative possibility. There's like this, they're not reducible, right? And yet then with time, people in relationships can be real certain that they know this person. Well, they've forgotten that initial feeling of you can't reduce them, of this creative excess. And if you remembered that, well, then your relationship that feels stuck, or your job that feels stuck, or whatever, could be opened up again because you've gone back to the origin and remembered the no-thingness. Like you've gone back and actually made it apophatic again. But the brain really struggles to keep that in focus. It really struggles to keep something definitive, dang it, to keep it apophatic, to keep it in that definitiveness, and it recollects it into certainty. It recollects it into a single image, and then it's lost, and then you're on a train track, and you can't get off of it. So I think it's an excellent question. also what you were saying, but I'll throw it to Christian, Michael. I'll throw it to Christian, Daniel, Michael, Sam, and then anyone else. But let me throw it to Christian, because also what you're saying about death and relationships is really important. But I'll pause. We'll talk about that. Let me throw it to Christian. Christian.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I have a meeting. I just let them postpone for 5 minutes because I had some stuff I really wanted to say. These conversations, they're so sticky. And once you have that thing in your head, you oh God, to just let it die, fuck, it's tragic. But yeah, I think you're with Ethan's question and your comments, Daniel. You were getting around one thing I wanted to talk about, which is the relationship between, well, you're using the term origin, the apophatic, the whatever, and memory. And I think I just would basically kind of echo the points you were making. Bringing the no-thingness into memory, I think, is important. And I also think that there's, a way to hold the word remembering, which doesn't necessarily imply the past. I mean, I'm probably just being like creative with my wordplay here. And it almost smells like pseudo intellectualism a bit, but a kind of remembering the wholeness of the present. Because when we are in our frameworks, whether it's always some mixture of past and future and all of that, but we are less of our attention, less of our presence is here in the moment, right? And so to like remember the present moment is, I think, a kind of remembering. And I think that's where I would like land with like how the confluence of these two ideas. There's something. Well, I'll have to table this because I'm something I need to think more about. But like, I want to challenge the way we're using the word nudges, because I want to rescue something about nudges that I think is bigger than the way you're using it, Daniel. And so it's just like a word thing, because I think we'll probably agree on the like core principles behind the points I would make. I guess I'll say like the direction I want to go in. Should I say anything now? I'll just say this. The direction I want to go in is that I feel like nudging, and the way I'm holding it, is almost just like an unavoidable thing that's happening. Nature is nudging us. We're nudging each other all the time. So it's probably just a definitional discrepancy there, but and I think you can be nudged toward the remembering, towards the apophatic. There's maybe a kind of like a nudging, which is a move that obstructs you in some way. I also think there's just like benign nudging as well, but I think there can be this kind of philosophical nudging. Maybe you could say Socrates was engaging in a kind of nudging when he would help people move into a state, like an aphoretic state. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Did I write it down? That's a framework. That was unintelligible. It was something about apphoretics and, oh yeah, this was an older, like previous in the conversation, which is, I'm sure this is something that's been said a million times, and I'm not just well read enough to like give a good reference for it, but to hold all frameworks as essentially propositional, I think is just like a good baseline. I mean, that's what I try to do as much as possible. But then, there's the tension, of course, of like, all right, how uncertain do I feel now that I need to take action, basically. And I have my own little, like my little meter, which is like, do I do this thing or do I not do this thing? And then my meter is like, it's usually somewhere in the middle, not very close to either extreme. And that's like the best I can do, right? And this is the but in that, I am surprising myself, right? There's a little bit of a self surprise there, which I think is unavoidable, but also part of the beauty of life is that, like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know which way my feelings are going to lean. When I start thinking, well, I hope I don't, right? That's kind of the philosophical orientation, is to not have a preconceived idea of where I'm going to end as I contemplate something, rather than just trying to build up some type of justification for where I want to land. Yeah, there's more I should say, but I got to run. Great conversation, everyone. I'll talk to you later.
Always good to have you, Chris, and thank you for coming. I'll throw it to Daniel, Michael, and then Sam here just very quickly. Yeah, certainly when we talk about nudge, we have in mind CAS, nudge theory, the unintentional consequences, and cybernetics, where it makes things fragile. Certainly distinctions can be made between nudge, inspire, shine, attract. There are differences here. The way we are using nudge also is tied to basically public policy that has like a set idea of the good. And there's also something where nudging does not necessarily change or develop the subject toward virtue. So any result that you get from the nudge is probably not sustainable. But it's very fair. I really like, just the one thing I'll say and then throw it, is that I really like remembering the present. There's something about that is pulling you back from a train track when you do that. Like when people say present, for me, there's something about that is pulling back from a train track or something. And so like when you remember the present, you're trying to actually keep your mind from running. Like, you know how you have a voice in your head that's like having a conversation with someone or your boss or you're pissed off? There's a way in which that is a very pure experience of rationality. And I know we don't tend to associate the voice in your head that's mad at someone, and I'll throw it to Daniel here, but like you're doing that because you feel justified. They did something wrong to you, dang it. Therefore, it's rational to tell them off, right? And so that feeling of this like voice in your head that's just running away from you, that's kind of an experience of the train track. And the argument that I am making is that voice that's just running around, you're like, oh my gosh, I was just in a 20-minute argument in my head yelling at someone. That is actually experience of what's happening on the macro scale with history constantly, all the time. And we're not able to pull ourselves back. And there's something about being present that actually is bringing a kind of, wait a minute, let me restart. Let me have a new origin. Let me start again. Let me restart. And there's like bringing back no thingness. And so I love that idea of remembering the bread. But let me throw it to Daniel here. Daniel, thank you for being, sir.
No, good to see you and good to see everyone. That's Daniel, just on that thread you're on now, like this from Jesus, that when he ups the stakes in the Sermon on the Mount in terms of anger and thought, and like anger expressed in thought as holding the weight of anger expressed otherwise. He uses the word raka, which I haven't like it's in the English versions, it's just directly raka, which I saw somewhere. It's associated with like a throat clearing sound, so like don't clear your throat at your brother, or something like that. Like this I think spit is a very fruitful contemplative aid, but just this I find this, like, what is the gesture that makes one clear one's throat at someone? But I wasn't intending to say anything in this direction. It's also just like in the realm of my own personal symptoms. I have this symptom of clearing my throat, and very recently I realized that it is associated to an aggressive thought to another. Yeah, it's less aggressive. It's more like wanting to clear something. It's like it's not quite being able to stomach what is happening relationally. So there's maybe even like this like there's disgust elements. Disgust is a very strong word, but something of that kind. And then there's this like bodily gesture to try and clear that. But that's involved in the estimation of someone as, or some relational setup as impure, or like needing to be purged. But I've probably gone like way too far into just this very immediate personal symptom. So I'll change the tracks. the tracks. Maybe I can just add to the image. The so returning to the origin and then setting a new direction. There's this a tragic, the grammar of thought or the rule of thought or the logic that is dominating one's progression or thought means that wherever you go, it's going to be a train track. And the train track exercises the same movement at each moment. Like I think Daniel, you said like the origin is there at every stage in the journey. So the often when people speak about first principles, and they will start speaking about, say, like a principle. So like, what is the principle of thought? Is it non-contradiction? Or then what does it mean to have one's thought grounded in contradiction? That's immediately slippery, because contradiction is apparently not one thing. So like, what is the engine of thought that is contradiction, and what kind of train tracks is that, and what does that mean about our origin? I've been thinking about that a lot in the last few days, and it has some kind of it has a theological relevance almost. I don't know if I'm going to be kind of reaching too much here, but I'm definitely associating this coming into a sense of how contradiction might function as a first principle of thought, or the truth of thinking, because maybe this is like the non-rational choice, that contradiction is the truth of thinking, that then sets up the momentum of thought, or that contradiction is truth. That gets you somewhere different to the decision, which also has a degree of ungroundedness, that non-contradiction is the principle of thought, from which when you're moving in your thinking, it's the origin is there in every step of your thought, and at some point thought returns to well, does it? It doesn't, unless someone provokes you, or some major life crisis, or it's not a necessity that thought turns back on itself to ask what is moving it, or what its grounds are. And another, it's been a growing thought for myself. The gist of it is that philosophy is actually dangerous. It's actually dangerous. It's not. It's people can gesture to like philosophy is good, or we enjoy it, or like there's something valuable about it. It's like the civilized position is to recognize philosophy as this nice inheritance, or it's like it's amongst the arts and the crafts or something. It's like it's a good human thing, but it's actually dangerous. The place of thought and the causality of one's life is fundamentally determinative and orientating. If you're playing with the grounds of your thought, that it's I'll say it for the last time, I guess, it's actually dangerous. So but I mean, I started with Jesus, and we also, Socrates is always like nearby, and both of these are figures who are killed by the prevailing authority of the day, and so it's not frivolous. I mean, in a small way, that has played out in my own life in terms of encountering ideas that in the space of an educational environment, there was safety to, say, explore with them. But then the degree to which one commits to or lets those ideas orientate one's life only grows with gravity the older one gets. Or as each year passes, because the stakes seem to, you can entertain an idea at university, and then when you're making decisions that concretely manifest the thoughts that you've touched or entertained, or maybe even expressed an appreciation for, or really put your foot in it and say like, that thought changed something in me, or like help me, then it is, I'm going to say it one more time, it is actually dangerous. Philosophy is a dangerous activity, and I value it, but there are stakes, and I think it's maybe there's some compassion in that view, and it helps to understand resistance to the activity of philosophy, to turning thought, to thinking about one's presuppositions, which maybe this is the last thing that I'll say, and linking back into adding to the image of the train tracks, and then also just some light thoughts in terms of contradiction, non-contradiction, and then that there might be some theological background or resonance as to which direction one takes. And in the shorthand, I think Christianity is something like the exposure of the possibility, or maybe even the merit of contradiction being the engine of one's being. And this would be opposed to, say, the choice that non-contradiction is, and non-contradiction, if that's the engine, it has to, it's not clear how it grounds itself. But I think I'm probably saying that too loosely, and it would be a bigger conversation, but it is what is most present for me at the moment, and it implicates these same subjects of death. My younger brother he's 14, and he just came to me with some questions about, he's been thinking about dying or something. I wasn't able to get much from him, but there is something, I think Ethan brought it up as well, in terms of like the termination of a relationship. There's a completion that affords something. There is this this value, or this maybe even necessity, in the way that Thomas was speaking about death. And then how do we relate to that necessity without relying on biological death, without relying on external circumstances somehow orchestrating the conditions in which some completion or finality eventuates itself, so that we can accept or have that completion pass through us. I think that's probably quite a big and important question, and I think of martyrs in that domain, like martyrdom as a, well, it only happens after you die, so you are called a martyr retroactively, but I mean, there's a critique of martyrdom, but it's a very difficult critique to make, because you're meant to, off the bat, just honor that positioning. And let me not go down that garden path now. Let me pass it back.
All right. Well, first off, we're going to Ethan's to eat off the grill. It's going to be great. Second, it's real dangerous. I'm going to throw it to Michael here in a minute, and then if anyone has final things to say, I think I'm going to call this one Original Train Tracks. I like trains. I'm going to use that meme. It's going to be great. You said a bunch of things. So, the longer you go, the more danger it is. This is why I think it's really unfortunate we don't begin teaching people very young how to engage in good choice making, as Forrest Landry emphasized, design, really thinking decisions through. I'm not saying perfect knowledge is possible, but really, really, really to be aware of what train track you're going down, how you're organizing your life. These things are really important. And again, there's something about Heidegger that wants us to think death precisely so you can bring this potential of it to take you to the origin, in the way I mean it, the truth, before the event occurs, right? Because you actually need this to be happening all the time. Like you need this all the time. Yeah, the new form of the trolley problem. That's it. Because you need to always be like making it alive again. So what I would say, and also, yes, there always is a train track. There's never no train track. That's why anti-rationalism is very problematic, because you're denying that there is a train track or that it's possible not to have one. And then the origin's more like a black hole, actually, and sucks everything in. So you need the train track in the same way that in Hegel, you have to have determination. Also, I would note critically, the only way contradiction can be ontological is if time-space is the case, not space-time, because the contradiction is the unfolding of the tension of the thing through time. And so then logic has to be temporal, and that temporality must be observed in the definitiveness of a phenomenon. Like, because you have to observe a thing change through time, and that means you have to be relating to something continually and regularly, like a spouse. And that is where time is real. Like time will not be primary for you if you are not regularly relating with the quote unquote same thing, same person that is changing through time. And that makes time very real. And then you find out time is what makes possible partial objects. Time makes things, time is why there is a difference between particular and definitive. Like if there was no time, there'd be general, particular, but there'd be no definitive, not in any real sense. Like the reason why you get a distinction between general, particular, and definitive is the difference between a woman, the particular, and the definitive, Michelle, is temporality. That difference comes out in time, right? Otherwise, yeah, there'd technically still be a difference between a woman and Michelle, but it practically would be irrelevant. Time is what makes that difference matter. And that is an unfolding that comes from the contradiction that your idea of Michelle is never the fullness of Michelle. And yet, nevertheless, that idea is how you know Michelle. And that creates a very tension that creates life that is only managed through temporality, through time, as time space. What I also want to say, and I'll throw it to Michael, and if anyone has final things on this fine evening, is that I like what you were saying about clearing something, Heidegger clearing, but philosophy is dangerous. So you ought to do it in love. You ought to do it in like love and community and relationship, right? Because when you are questioning and going to the origin with somebody who loves you or in a community, they're not going to ostracize or hate you. They're not going to kick you out. So the issue is the danger of philosophy and also the reward of, there's a real sense in which the glory of philosophy comes out in beauty. Right? Well, beauty requires love, relationship, and commitment, right? So there's a real issue where the danger of philosophy is likely to win out in a philosophical melancholia that David Hume warned about, ergo meaning crisis, ergo all the stuff we've seen. That is likely to win out when philosophy is separated from friendship, which I know Mr. Jockin has spoken on is very important, when it is not the quality of our social relations. Because in social relations, the danger of philosophy, which by the way, actually is really important because that means philosophy can be thymotic. And a lack of themos in society today is killing us. We have logos, eros, but not themos. And so we get the disordered tripart soul and we're in trouble and we have the masculinity crisis, courage crisis, all that stuff because themos is really freaking important. And Limburg has talked about, we've all talked about that. So the very danger of philosophy gives it a thematic character. But if you want that danger not to be like anti-logos, like not wise, it needs to be bound and brought into community. Well, then you need to find people that do that. And before the social coordinating mechanism, that was hard to do. And you had to be lucky and just join the old guy at the diner in the morning, right? So for most of history, you could make an argument that indeed the danger of philosophy was probably not worth it for many people in many different circumstances because very few people could meet other people in order to actually bring it into a social situation, right? Well, that's changing now with the social coordination mechanism, and you could also argue that universities' centralization of intellectual life were part of overcoming that problem because you could explore ideas as a professor, as someone who lived on the university and not be socially ostracized, but that centralized this potential that now, in order to lead to a new address of our current global moment, needs to be spread, and we now have the technology of the social coordination mechanism as an infrastructure to actually do it, but there is wisdom in the historic hesitation of the spread of philosophy, precisely because it is dangerous, and without, I think, community, ultimately it will be either philosophical resentment or philosophical melancholia. It will not lead to virtue and beauty. However, I would say it has always actually been very important in relationships, even if it was dangerous, because you inevitably tend to fall into your ideas of other people, judge them, end up on a train track, and your marriage then becomes stale, right? So like philosophy also philosophy has a real danger, but there's also a real danger in not having it, where you get stuck on a train track, where you get stuck going down and you can never get off of it, right? So can't avoid danger. We can try to manage it or procedure it away all we like, has been the dream of modernity, but that doesn't get rid of the danger. That just makes us unprepared for it. But let me give it to Michael, and then if anyone has fine things before Ethan serves us. Michael, please.
Getting hungry over here. I had written earlier when Thomas was talking about his experience with his father and like wanting to have those memories that earlier he didn't want, and that experience of death and the limit reminding us what is meaningful. I had written an intimate encounter with temporality, and I think that encounter allows us to have, I mean, it makes things sacred. I think it's like the ground for sacred and preciousness is the realization that it has a life cycle. And I was just reflecting on it today, came out of the men's circle, and I was just feeling really grateful for it. And oftentimes I'll have experiences where I'll reflect and have gratitude for something. But I think it's only kind of more recently that I realize that, and I'm kind of on the edge of my thinking, so I don't exactly know how to articulate this, but that there's that isn't like a guarantee. That isn't like a guarantee thing. I had to, someone had to create that space, right? Jacob and Matthew had to co-create that space. They had to over years kind of, tinker and and refine it. And they had to go through all sorts of life experiences to get to the point where they wanted to bring that in the world. And then I had to be of the kind of disposition to want to do that. And then, had to move things around in my schedule and commit to it, all these things. And that is I think when you're only aware of the space, right? That can breed gratitude. You can be aware of, oh, this space, the net is special in all these ways. But it seems like only when you are aware of the temporality of it, that there was a time when this didn't exist. Who knows, maybe Haven will take this over when you die, but there will probably be a lifespan to it. And so that kind of just takes gratitude to another level, and it breeds love. And Christian was saying something a while ago about love, and then Ethan was talking about the kind of more Eastern ideas, and I was just thinking about the Eastern idea of non-attachment, and kind of the sense that dukkha or suffering in Buddhism is due to our attachments to things, our expectations of things. And I'm certainly not saying there isn't potent forms of love in Eastern traditions, but I think there's a sense in which that kind of I don't know, it seems like it maybe sidesteps temporality a little bit. Because I think you have to like, be totally and completely in an embodied sense attached to the things that you love. And and I think critically, like, the where people get stuck is if you don't have kind of the sense of the vertical, you don't have a sense of when someone passes, there is something eternal about them. There is something eternally spiritual that continues to live on, in their memory. Their memory carries you forth. It continues to inform the person you are, and the way you spread the essence of who they were into the world. But I think that intimate encounter with temporality is really important. The last thing I wanted to say was around the kind of non-rational move to question, certainty when it comes to relationships. To instead of kind of calcifying that Jim's a dick, to question that. And I was kind of just wrestling with that, and I kind of just like wanted to add a wrinkle of, I've had I had a parent who, like, pathologically narcissistic, verbally, physically abusive, all that stuff. Had an affair, like, and I've chosen to be estranged for 5-6 years, and who knows if that will be the decision I have, going forward. But what I've realized is, because I've often thought about, walking to his front door one day, forgiving him, trying to have a relationship and all this. And then I kind of go back and I'm like, forgiveness can look a lot of different ways. And for me, my responsibility is to make sure the memory that I've had, the things that have happened to me, I don't take that and put those goggles on and look at the rest of the world that way. Like, that's been my, therapeutic philosophical journey, is when I encounter people who might trigger certain things that remind me of that, to exactly what you said, Daniel, to question if that's really the truth, or is that something that I remembered when I was 5, or experienced whatever when I was that age. And so to constantly kind of check and balance yourself of how much are the memories of the particular getting like transmitted out into the universal, because that's also another possibility with memory, is its capacity, and that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. In a good way, a particular experience of love can make you love the convict or the drug addict, or, like, it can extend to the universal in places that someone who hasn't had that experience might not be able to. But it can also do the exact opposite, I think, as well. And so I think that's, I just kind of just felt like called to add that as kind of another dimension of, because I know for a lot of people, they don't see it as a possibility to try and completely shift their understanding of someone in their life who has really wronged them. But I think that's the move towards love, is how can I open to the rest of the world and realize that the experience that I had is not totalizing. It's not representative of all of humanity. But yeah.
No, that's a fantastic wrinkle and a critical wrinkle, and I appreciate it very much. I'll throw it to Daniel here, and then if anyone has final things before Ethan serves us. I think first off, the space making you're describing with Jacob, etc. I think the work of, and Jochen has spoken about this, the work of space making. Perhaps it would be a larger topic. Perhaps that is some of the key communal work. And like you say, there's a time where it didn't exist. And do note, like in a Heideggerian sense, When you realize that there was a time when it didn't exist, that's making you realize there was an origin. And so actually freeing you from a single train track of rationality, because you go, oh, it could have not been. But now that it is, and it's rational to go, right? Because I've had certain experiences, right? So there's a origin that is there that also invites you. Are you making origins in your life? Are you making things that can be origins for people that could put them on a different train track in a different direction? This is an important work. Space making. I think we often talk about products, making products or making services. We don't think enough about making spaces, because spaces also open things that are surprising in good ways. Mr. Jockin, thank you for being here. I think also, so there's something here. So Jim's a dick versus, there's an idea versus like real trauma, right? Well, memory is mythological. It's like, it would be simple if all you had to do was basically just decide that there are no bad people or something, or people don't do anything wrong, right? Like you wouldn't actually have to kind of go on a certain journey. You'd have a certain judgment beforehand. And what I mean by that is because like you say, there's also something about, it seems to me also that there are interesting differences between when you're talking about how your coworker, Jim, is always doing stuff wrong and you're mad at him and you kind of have an idea that he's unreliable, versus, say, the example you're making where you have a family member or someone in your life that has genuinely abused and you're trying to decide the wise way to relate to that person, right? There's also a different emotional orientation. Like I find when I'm dealing with, say, Jim, as there is no real Jim, but let's say I'm dealing with Jim, I just find myself in the shower with an angry voice that's going on, right? It's like it's taken over and I feel myself just pulled along, right? That seems very different than when I think personally about situations where I am dealing with someone who has genuinely does something bad. Maybe they don't apologize. Maybe they're not repentant. Maybe they haven't done any work to improve the virtue. And there's a feeling of a certain wisdom not to interact with that person. Not because you're saying they can never come around. There's not like a final judgment closing off the future, but a certain wisdom to say certain things need to be seen. Like you need to see certain things. What's very interesting, I guess I'm speaking personally, is that always I experience that differently than Jim, where there's a voice running away. With the other, there's almost a certain sort of wisdom. Now, I would say that there is something I think important, even with someone who has genuinely done something wrong, to not even regarding that person have the runaway voice, right? Because they actually are still wronging you if you allow that, because they're pulling you on a train track, right? Like if you're just constantly having dialogues in your mind of how angry you are at that person, that I think is a problem, because they actually are still pulling you along, right? But that is different from getting to a place where you say it is wise at this point to interact less for X, Y, and Z. Not from a state of unforgiveness, but from a state of wisdom, right? And discernment, right? And you have to, and only you can know if you find yourself cutting the grass and you have an angry dialogue going on in your head in different places, right? And you have to examine yourself in those different ways. But that's the mythology of memory. That's all a kind of mythical quest and journey and battle to tell those differences and to actually identify when am I dealing with Jem and when am I dealing with a dangerous, like a danger that actually would not be wise to interact with, right? But this all, yeah, there we go. This, and I'll throw it to Daniel, but this all comes to the massive $1 million, $1,000 problem of forgiveness that is utterly underthought, because there does seem to be a possibility of being wise to have distance and that not equaling unforgiveness, like the unwillingness to ever forgive, right? Or the unwillingness to observe transformation through time at certain points, right? There seems to be a difference between a certain closing off from the person versus having distance. Because it does seem in Christianity, there has to be an ever openness to the possibility of redemption and transformation and change. What that looks like and how is another thing. Churches have they were talking about this at the TLC. we've lost the sense of like church discipline or procedure to come back into redemption, or what transfers. So we're all very confused about that. That is a very underthought thing. Ross Bird and Christian were talking about that. They have a fantastic conversation on actually like what exactly do people need to do to actually show transformation that is not a Bonhoffian cheap grace, right? This is, I actually think, very underthought, and I think it is a massive burden. And if anyone wants to really kind of systematically take up that project, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it really needs to be thought, because we're just very confused on to what degree should you cut off? Are you being bitter and unforgiving if you're cut off? Are you being wise? What's too open and what's not? We don't have a good account of that. What I will say is if that there's a runaway voice running, like if all your day, all of your energy is being drained because you're pissed off at Jim, or you have a voice running off in your head, that's not the correct way to do it. That's not right. You're being pulled along on a train track. And actually you need to do the work of memory. I mean, there's something also to be said about the work of memory that actually makes you feel more grounded in your assessment to cut off. So you don't have a voice running in your head because you're more confident in the decision you've made. Actually, sometimes the voices running off in your head is more likely when there's an ambiguity, actually. So going into memory and being like, no, that person actually did very generally do something very bad and dangerous. Therefore, it's wise. Oh, okay. Well, you don't have the voice running off. It's more of a wise thing, right? So there are these different experiential questions that have to be brought up. More can be said on that extremely important topic. And it all points to the ultra topic of forgiveness. But I'll throw it to Daniel, and then we're going to eat because Ethan's serving. Daniel, please.
Well, thanks, Adam. The forgiveness, also just appreciation for the space making of the net, and just coming from, it's about 1:45 in the morning this side, and I've been kind of it's such a weird space. Like we online connected here, but this tendency of thought for me to be like related to the cell phone, and then forget that it's kind of people, real others, and then I guess I feel just a bit of remorse for the momentum with which I started speaking last, and so I'm speaking out of a kind of lack, that sense of lack. I'm like responding to that, so like risking speech and not responding to that sense. And it meant that, I mean, I wouldn't prioritize the one thing, which the general gratitude for the space making. I also wish I'd shared my condolences with Thomas a bit more directly around his father. I kind of in the slew of what I said last, there was this theme that links into this theme of forgiveness, which is I was linked onto the work of this Aramaic scholar who makes a lot of the Aramaic translation of Jesus's teaching. There's a particular document that is used that was surfaced like the 9th century or whatever, and the reframing, or what he offers as a contribution to our thinking and practicing forgiveness. I think he says the translation, something a bit closer to how Jesus would have used the word, would have been to cancel the goal. That's very interesting in terms of sublation as like cancel lifting, but forgiveness as canceling the goal. So like you forgive someone when you cancel the goal that you held over them in relation to them in some way. And I mean, there'll be a practice of framing those thoughts like, I expect or want that person to make me happy in this or that way. And the forgiveness is something like canceling that goal that you hold over them. But there is this, there is something that I think I don't want to overemphasize this, but I think we stand to re-emphasize it. The degree of freedom that we have in an internal sense, specifically in relation to something like forgiveness. So instead of being caught in the dilemma in the relational instance, there is a work that can happen in, say, the interiority or in oneself that changes the coordinates of the relationship. That means forgiveness doesn't have this so much of an other dependence, such that it's this dilemma of now, how do I meet the person? Because what does that mean about how I have forgiven them or not forgiven them? There would be something to retain about the embodiment emphasis, that the root for thought, emotions stored in the body. The same scholar, it's contextualizing it. I mean, the tendency of the kind of contribution is to say, like, no, it's not the Greek emphasis of Holy Spirit, it's the Aramaic, and then you're putting the interpretations against one another instead of letting them speak to one another. So one of his things is that this the Greek emphasis gives the sense that the Holy Spirit is some like disembodied but bodied entity, so like some ghost-like figure, where the Aramaic in his work is very much pointing to very literally breath or breathing. So with the significance to breath that gives, there's a resource that links into that work of forgiveness that is really opening up the space for achieving freedom in oneself. That is the defragging, say, of one's nervous system, of the implicit goals one is holding over others, that one cancels in the act of forgiveness. Which I mean, like Buddha might be making the absolute claim in this direction that this is the only way you achieve freedom, is by that process of, I'm stumbling, but I was saying like internal defragging, or going within, and very, but it's just to add it there, because I mean, when I came across this scholar and thought about him and was pointed to him and this reframing of forgiveness, I was looking forward to sharing it with you, Daniel, specifically because of especially a few months ago, this was a big theme coming up, and as you said, is the arch problem, or it is the problem. It kind of links. You just mentioned the TLC, Daniel. I saw some clips this week. I saw some YouTube videos on Paul van der Klee getting some airtime, referencing the girdle point. I don't know if you saw. I was very chuffed to see you there linking, and I don't know how involved you are in the TLC. But I'm assuming also an earlier thread in the conversation in terms of some of the, I think you reported some feeling of resistance to philosophy, or philosophy does something to community, that there is this suspicion about. I'm assuming that's kind of sourced from a more TLC area, which, I'm very excited about this. I've never, I haven't engaged too much with the TLC. I'm aware of the general space. I'm like aware of Paul van der Klee, like a very loose contact with that. I know Cadell was kind of wishing into existence more contact between Paul and Peter Rawlins, and there is this potential for generative something to happen there. So I was pleased to see your face and voice appearing on some of the channels, specifically Paul's.
No, it was lovely. It was nice of Vanderclay to do that. I know he had picked up one of the talks at Aspasia, Seth and I did, and was talking about the Gödel point. And I also had a chance to speak with Christian. I enjoyed it very much. And no, I think for me, kind of a connection between that question is going to the topic of lack that for me can link Aristotle Lacan. So there's a lot there, and how lack also opens up beauty. I think also what you're saying with the Holy Spirit is holy breathing. It is very, Rahi, I think Morterman talks about the word spirit tied to breath. It is very interesting and important to think that very often we can kind of focus on the question of forgiveness as proximity to other, but there could be something to be said about focusing on do I have holy breathing or not? Because if I don't have holy breathing, or I probably even if I was in proximity with that other, it may just set me up for trauma, or perhaps I couldn't actually shine with something that would transform them from being the person that did that wrong thing. Like there's also a kind of idea that without holy breathing, you couldn't be the kind of person that would model the transformation that may inspire that person who did something wrong to be different, right? So there does seem to be something to be said about the question of forgiveness and holy breathing being tied together. And there is something to be said about communities having holy breathing that seem to kind of come together in powerful, powerful ways. I have enjoyed this evening very much. I have more notes. Thank you for coming. Daniel, to be up at 1 a.m. is saintly. Ethan, I hope you are enjoying your meal. It looked delicious. Michael, good to see you. Thank you, Clayton. You're a saint. I love what you put in the chat. Thank you all for coming. It's been a delight. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for being here, sir. It's a treat. Ethan, thank you, sir. Appreciate it very much. You all have a great one. All the best.
Take care.